Hi, I'm Carmen from the Creative Sewist blog, and in today's video we are going to be talking all about pressing. Why you should never skip pressing, how to get the best results possible, and all of the pressing tools that you should know. Let's start with the why. Many beginner sewists, and even some non-beginners, skip pressing because no one likes ironing and everyone just wants to get to the sewing. But pressing makes a massive difference in the results that you're able to get from your sewing. You'll get flatter, crisper seams and avoid that rumpled, bubbly seamed, stereotypically homemade look. The pressing just really helps to blend the stitching into the fabric and make everything look nice, flat, crisp, and professional. It really does make a huge difference. Now, when you press, you want to be pressing as you sew, not all at the end. If you wait till the end, you're just not going to get the same results. So you want to press each seam after you sew it and before you sew another intersecting seam across it. This helps you to make sure that you get that seam nice and flat, get that stitching set and everything looking good before you sew any other seams across it. So for example, you could sew the side seams and the shoulder seams of a shirt, press all 4 of those seams before attaching the sleeves. This is because the sleeve is going to intersect with both of those seams, the shoulder seam at the top of the shoulder and the side seam at the underarm area. Now, if that just seems like too much to keep track of, you can definitely just press each seam after you sew it so that you don't have to keep track of whether or not you're getting ready to sew an intersecting seam or how many you can sew before you need to press. You can just press each seam right after you sew it. There's nothing to keep track of, and you'll make sure that every seam gets a good pressing before anything gets sewn over it. So let's move on to how to actually press. So to get started with pressing, first set your iron to the appropriate temperature and steam setting for your fabric. A lot of irons have a guide on them to tell you what kind of fabric is best for each setting, but if you're not sure, just make sure to test a small scrap piece of your fabric before you press your project. You want to find the setting that gets you the nicest, flattest seams, but that doesn't burn or melt your fabric. Then when you have your seam ready to press, take it to your ironing board and center the seam on your ironing board with the wrong side up. Then you want to go in and just finger press, so just push with your fingers, push the seam allowances either open, so away from each other, or to one side, which usually would be towards the back. Then you can go in with your iron and press those seam allowances really nice and flat using an up and down motion rather than a side to side motion. A side to side motion is easier, but it can stretch out your fabric, which you really don't want, especially before it's sewn up. This is especially a problem if you're working with a fabric that's not really nice and structured, or if your fabric is cut on the bias, it will be really prone to stretching out. So in those cases, you want to be super careful to press with only an up and down motion rather than sliding the iron across the fabric. Now, once you've got it pressed from the wrong side, I often like to flip the seam over and give it another good pressing from the right side just to make sure that everything is nice and flat and beautiful. All right, now that you know the why and the how of pressing, let's get into a few pressing tools that will really help you make your sewing life easier. First up, we have a pressing cloth. So a pressing cloth is just a piece of fabric, usually cotton muslin like this one, or silk organza like this one, that can handle really high heats. The pressing cloth is something that you can place in between the iron and the fabric to make sure that you're not going to burn your fabric or change the color of your fabric, which is really great for fabrics that don't handle heat well. So you can either purchase a pressing cloth or just make one yourself. If you're making one yourself, you want to make sure that you choose a fabric that handles high heat well, because it needs to be able to basically max out the heat of your iron without burning or melting. You also want to make sure that you choose an undyed fabric so that you don't have any risk of the pressing cloth transferring dye stains to your project. That would be no fun to deal with. The next tool we're going to talk about is a tailor's ham. So it has kind of a funny name, but a tailor's ham is basically just a ham-sized very tightly stuffed pillow-like item, which is usually made from wool on one side and cotton on the other. Now, the tailor's ham is really great for pressing curved seams because you can form the shape of the seam to the curve of the ham rather than attempting to press it flat on your ironing board, which can often get some puckering and it just doesn't look quite as nice. So you can get nice, crisp, well-pressed curved seams with a tailor's ham. Now, the wool side of the ham is usually intended for thicker, squishier fabrics like wool that usually are at a slightly lower temperature setting, whereas the cotton side of the ham is made for smoother fabrics that handle higher heats. A seam roll here is another tool that can really help you out with pressing. So this looks pretty similar to the tailor's ham. It's another stuffed, pillowy kind of item that's made with wool on one side and cotton on the other. The difference here is the size and the shape of the item. So this tool is much smaller and more narrow than the tailor's ham, which is perfect for pressing narrow tubular areas. So for example, sleeve cuffs, ankle cuffs, anything like that. You can put the fabric around the seam roll and press it nice and flat without worrying about creasing the other side of the fabric. Next up, we have a tailor's clapper. So a clapper is really just a block of wood. It doesn't have to have this point thing on top. Sometimes it's just this block of wood, usually made from hardwood. So a clapper, it seems weird, but a clapper can really help you get super flat, nice seams from fabrics like wools or things that are thicker and squishier that don't really press very readily without any additional help. So to use your clapper, first just press your seam like normal using the techniques we talked about at the beginning of this video. And with a clapper, it usually works best if you use steam while you're pressing. So you'll want to give your fabric a little spritz before you press so that it steams, or just use the steam button or steam setting on your iron. Next, as you take the iron away from the fabric, you're going to want to place the clapper down on the fabric and just let it set there on the seam for about 10 seconds. Now, if the fabric is pretty thick and really doesn't like to press flat, you can hold firmly down on the clapper during that 10 seconds. If it's a thinner fabric, you usually don't need to actually hold down on the clapper. And then while the wood is in contact with that hot, steamed seam, it's going to pull the heat out of the seam and into the wood, cooling it faster than it normally would. And this is going to help you get a super flat seam. This is really a good technique for fabrics like wool if you want to get a really professional look from your wool garments. The last tool we're going to talk about today is a sleeve board, this big thing. So this is a super useful tool when you want to press narrow areas like sleeves. So if you have ever tried to press sleeves on a long sleeve shirt with your regular ironing board and tried to fit the sleeves around the narrow end of your ironing board, it really doesn't work very well. So then you end up having to try to press your sleeves flat on the ironing board, and it's so hard not to get creases in the bottom side of the sleeve. So this is what solves that issue for you, because you can fit narrow areas, you can fit sleeves, pant legs, things like that across this instead of having to resort to pressing it flat on your regular ironing board. So let's get back to sewing, and remember not to forget to press.